Hello, my name is Minjung Kim, and I'm the Director and CEO of the New Britain Museum of American Art, one of, if not arguably, the oldest museums dedicated exclusively to American art. The New Britain Museum of American Art is honored to collaborate with the Joseph and Anni Albers Foundation on our current exhibition in thread and on paper, Anni Albers in Connecticut, featuring an extensive body of textiles, wall hangings, commercial collaborations, and works on paper. This landmark presentation is the first museum exhibition devoted to Anni Albers' diverse output during her 44 years in Connecticut, as well as the artist's first major solo exhibition at a U.S. museum in over 20 years. In addition to numerous exhibition-related programs accessible on our website, I'm pleased to introduce the following lecture entitled Experiments. Presented by Fritz, Horstman, exhibition curator and education director at the Joseph and Anni Albers Foundation, and Karis, Medina, associate curator at the Joseph and Anni Albers Foundation. Experiments is a collaborative discussion that explores the remarkable work and writings of Anni Albers, one of the most important textile artists of the 20th century, as well as an influential designer, printmaker, and educator. On behalf of the New Britain Museum of American Art, I extend my profound gratitude to Fritz Horstman, Karis Medina, and the Joseph and Anni Albers Foundation for their generous collaboration. In thread and on paper, Anni Albers in Connecticut is part of the museum's 2020 20+ Women at the NBMAA initiative, sponsored by Stanley Black & Decker, with additional support provided by Bank of America. In thread and on paper is made possible by the generosity of the Kobe Foundation Limited. Exhibitions at the New Britain Museum of American Art are supported by Special Exhibition Fund donors, including John N. Howard, Sylvia Bonney, Anita Arcuni Ferrante and Anthony Ferrante, Marion and Russell Burke, and the Aeroflex Foundation. We also gratefully acknowledge the funding of Brendan and Carol Conry, Irene and Charles J. Ham, and Carolyn and Elliot Joseph. And now I welcome you to enjoy Experiments.
The textile artist Jack Leonard Larson referred to Anni Albers as a visionary when he presented her with the American Craft Council's Gold Medal in 1981. She responded in a letter to Larson, "As to name-calling, instead of visionary, I suggest experimenter." I'm Fritz Horstman. My colleague at the Albers Foundation, Karis Medina, and I were scheduled to give a lecture at the New Britain Museum of American Art in conjunction with the exhibition In Thread and on Paper, Anni Albers in Connecticut.
Because of the COVID-19 public health crisis, the museum is currently closed. We have adapted the material of our lecture for this video, which we have entitled Anni Albers Experiments.
Following Albers' idea that a weaving is a whole built out of parts, we will interweave quotes of her own with lines from some of the authors whom she referenced most frequently.
To conclude, we will hear from a few contemporary artists for whom Albers is especially influential. They themselves are experimenters in the ever-expanding field of textile.
Anni Albers moved to Connecticut in 1950, where she would live and work for 44 years. It was the third major geographical change of her life. Born in Berlin in 1899, Anneliese Fleischmann moved to Weimar, Germany in 1922 to attend the Bauhaus. That perpetually underfunded avant-garde school of art and design was only a few hundred kilometers south of Berlin, but was worlds apart from the elegant and privileged life she had known as a member of one of Germany's wealthy elite.
At the Bauhaus, she met her future husband, the artist Joseph Albers. Anni distinguished herself in the weaving workshop, where she eventually took on a teaching role. Under pressure from the Nazis, the Bauhaus closed in 1933, prompting the second and most dramatic relocation of Anni's life. Leaping at the opportunity to come to the United States, The Alberses arrived in November 1933 to teach at Black Mountain College, the newly formed progressive liberal arts college situated just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. Annie taught weaving there for 16 years, while Joseph taught painting, drawing, color, and design.
In 1949, the Alberses left Black Mountain College. That same year, Anni Albers became the first textile artist to have a solo exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. Annie was 50 years old and just hitting her stride. In 1950, Joseph was made chair of what was then known as the Design Department at Yale University, which brought the Alberses to Connecticut, where they first lived in New Haven and later, from 1970, in the nearby town of Orange.
With a studio in the house and no formal teaching duties, Annie entered the most productive period of her career, completing more than 30 pictorial weavings, 5 major commissions, and countless functional fabrics. She continued weaving, completing her final hand-woven piece in 1968, at which point she turned her attention to printmaking, a process that would captivate her for the next 20 years. She passed away on May 9, 1994.
Albers is widely considered to be one of the most influential textile artists of the 20th century. She is perhaps best known for her pictorial weavings, textiles that are meant to be seen primarily as artworks. In the catalog for an exhibition at MIT in 1959 entitled Anni Albers Pictorial Weavings, she wrote,
"Though some of the earliest weavings, unearthed after thousands of years, have the magic of things not yet found useful, and later periods have shown us weaving as art. Thousands of years of establishing and expanding the usefulness of woven materials have made us see in them first something to be worn, walked on, sat upon, to be cut up, even sewn together again. In short, largely something no longer itself fulfilled. To let threads be articulate again, to find a form for themselves to no other end than their own orchestration, not to be sat on, walked on, only to be looked at. That is the raison d'etre of my pictorial weavings."
In an interview with Nicholas Fox Weber in 1974, Albers described the beginnings of her pictorial weavings.
I just sat down at the loom and took some threads and allowed them to do what they wanted to do.
In the same interview, Albers said more about the term pictorial weaving, which she had coined to refer to those textiles headed in the direction of art.
I gave the name pictorial weavings to these pieces which I considered pictorial in character only to distinguish them from what usually is called a tapestry, which is a term which has to do with the technique of weaving. And since I went about it unconcerned about the tapestry, the actual tapestry technique, I later thought of the term pictorial weaving for those things which have nothing to do with the technique of tapestry.
She was keenly aware that textiles weren't always considered to be worthy of the label of art in the way that painting or sculpture might be. Though she also designed and created textiles that were primarily functional, her view, as stated in an undated lecture at Yale University, was that any creative endeavor could rise to the level of art.
Designing usually means to give shape to a useful object. We do not speak of designing a picture or a concerto, but we speak of designing a house, a city, a bowl, a fabric. But surely they all, like a painting or music, can be works of art. Usefulness does not prevent a thing, anything, from being art. We must conclude then that it is the thoughtfulness and care of the design that makes a house turn into art, and that it is this degree of thoughtfulness and care that we try to arrive at.
In a 1944 essay entitled We need the crafts for their contact with materials, she wrote. Artwork deals with the problem of a piece of art, but more, it teaches the process of all creating, the shaping out of the shapeless. We learn from it that no picture exists before it is done, no form before it is shaped. The conception of a work gives only its temper, not its consistency. Things take shape in material and in the process of working, and no imagination is great enough to know before the works are done what they will be like.
On a very fundamental level, she considered the act of giving form to art or craft to be an act of building a whole out of parts.
The surface quality of one material played against another, and that out of these textile elements, which were my medium, I should try to build a whole which in my mind was necessary to approach anything in the direction of art.
Albers was devoted to letting her materials guide her, to allowing them to speak and lead the creative process. She speaks more about this in the 1974 interview.
When you work with a material and a process, then you are absorbed by those two factors, and something happens what you might call unconsciously. And I have quite often said, and still believe that it would be quite a salvation to the present art scene if there was more concentration on a material and a process.
It was through her deep understanding of material and process that she was able to coax so much from her medium. She reveals a sort of empathy for its limitations and potentials in her essay, Art, a Constant, writing, "We can recognize in material a willing bearer of ideas, which we superimpose upon it, provided they are conceived in accordance with its structure."
The conscientious designer does not himself design at all, but rather gives the object to be a chance to design itself.
In her 1965 essay, Designing as Visual Organization, Albers continues to speak of the negotiations the designer must have with their materials. Material form becomes meaningful form through design, that is, through considered relationships. And this meaningful form can become the carrier of a meaning that takes us beyond what we think of as immediate reality. But an orderliness that is too obvious cannot become meaning in the superior sense that is art. The organization of forms, their relatedness, their proportions, must have that quality of mystery that we know in nature. Nature, however, shows herself to us only in part. The whole of nature, though we always see it, remains hidden from us. To reassure us, art tries, I believe, to show us a wholeness that we can comprehend.
Here we come to an important source, Albers' understanding of natural order. An important text during her time at the Bauhaus had been Wilhelm Voringer's Abstraction and Empathy. Our investigations proceed from the presupposition that the work of art, as an autonomous organism, stands beside nature on equal terms and, in its deepest and innermost essence, devoid of any connection with it, insofar as by nature is understood the visible surface of things. Natural beauty is on no account to be regarded as a condition of the work of art, despite the fact that in the course of evolution it seems to have become a valuable element in the work of art, and to some extent, indeed, positively identical with it.
Albers' work is nearly always abstract. However, she often titled her work with references to landscape or other elements of the natural world. Although rarely explicit, her thinking was informed by nature and many of the systems within it.
Your question of nature made me think of Goethe, who investigates plants from the standpoint of a system of numbers that they work with, that a plant that has mainly a system of 3 leaves on a little stem has again in the flowers the number 3 and so on, that it is very systematically always recurring to a certain system. And this in a way is related probably also to the work that abstract artists use.
Albers made her first prints in 1963.
Joseph had been asked by the Tamarind lithography workshop in California to come and do some lithos there. There was a woman there, June Wayne. So we went, both of us there, and he worked there in this workshop. One day, June Wayne asked me, "Don't you want to try something?" So I started something, and since I was a weaver still at that time and had threads on my mind, I made a drawing that showed threads or a thread which did more than it can do in weaving. In the discipline of weaving, you are always tied to a horizontal vertical, and here I was suddenly felt free to go into curves and interlacings and so on. I had the trouble, and probably others too, that galleries and museums didn't show textile that was always considered a craft and not art. And as I always said and still say, when it's on paper, it's art.
Having spent more than 40 years working almost exclusively in textile, Albers stopped weaving in 1968, gave away the last of her looms in 1970, and turned her creative energies primarily to printmaking. However, a lifetime spent with threads had made an impression on her. In a 1977 conversation with Jean Barrow, she remarked, "I am told that my earlier weaving experience somehow is still reflected in my unwoven work, my graphic work. The work is unconscious in the sense that you feel driven by a notion of what may seem, at a particular point, right or wrong in the chosen technique. Consciousness is necessary to order, an order that should not be instantly readable. Mystery is what draws us to art."
That mystery may take many forms. In 1952, Albers audited a course at Yale given by the renowned pre-Columbian scholar George Kubler. His 1962 book, The Shape of Time, provides some insight. Actuality is when the lighthouse is dark between flashes, the instant between the ticks of the watch, the void interval slipping forever through time, the rupture between past and future, the gap at the poles of the revolving magnetic field, infinitesimally small but ultimately real. It is the interchronic pause when nothing is happening. It is the void between events.
A few years after making her first print portfolio, Line Involvements, at Tamarind, Albers produced another set of prints that crossed between her former life in threads and her new ventures in print. Having used the meander as a basis for a weaving in 1954, she revisited the form, which continued the same theme of interlacing or wandering lines, for a series of screen prints in the early 1970s. She used printing techniques to achieve results that were not possible in weaving. Using a single silkscreen stencil, turned and overlaid in ways that enrich and animate the resulting image with very little added effort or material. Albers recorded the process of producing the meander prints, writing, 1. Background screen, solid color. 2. The cut design screen, 1/2 inch smaller than background screen. Print same color as background screen, placing it to the upper left corner of the background. 3. Turn design screen upside down, placing it to lower right corner. Print same color as background color. 4. Use new design color, diluted to be translucent, Only few inks make this possible and retain sufficient coloring power. Turn screen back to first designed position. Print, placing it equal distance from all edges.
In much of her later work, notably her 1967 studies for Camino Real, made in preparation for a commission for a wall hanging for the Camino Real Hotel in Mexico City, Albers was preoccupied by various triangular motifs for nearly 2 decades. Her repeated triangular compositions feel simultaneously ordered and chaotic. Though she rarely spoke about the origins of these triangles, she gave the following insight.
In my own work, when I am trying to develop a certain system of forms related to each other, I think of what nature does in the way of forming a crystal, and that is that nature inserts one impurity, which is a catalyst, is that moment that produces it to form itself. When it is 100% pure, a crystal doesn't form.
Alongside the conception of the natural world that Albers gleaned from Goethe, she took much from the mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, who in 1943 said, "Art is the imposing of a pattern on experience and our aesthetic enjoyment in recognition of the pattern."
Speaking on a panel at the College Art Association's 1982 annual conference, she returned to her themes of material and process, saying, "What I had learned in handling threads, I now used in the printing process. Again, I was led. My prints are not transfers from paintings to color on paper as is the usual way. I worked with the production process itself, mixing various media, turning the screens. What I'm trying to get across is that material is a means of communication, that listening to it, not dominating it, makes us truly active. That is, to be active, be passive. The finer tuned we are to it, the closer we come to art."
Annie returned to the idea of listening to material often. If this has the sound of a teacher's oft-repeated wisdom, it is because throughout her entire career as an artist, Albers was also an educator.
In fact, I divided up in my mind what I was doing by separating my work into 3 regions or areas, better. The things that were useful, which were meant later to be mass-produced, the things that were single pieces, which I put into a category in which I called in the direction of art. And number 3 was the teaching of weaving.
Teaching a fundamental knowledge of material and process can take many forms. During the earliest days at Black Mountain College, Albers had to find a way to teach weaving to her students without yet having access to looms. She had students create what she called pre-textile studies, essentially experiments in texture and structure, using everyday materials to mimic the surfaces or patterns of textiles.
Because at Black Mountain, I was for a while forced to work with a class in textiles without any looms because there was no building to house them. So I made them go out into the fields, and they collected seeds and pasted them together on paper just to simulate surfaces. I think in my book on weaving there are some photos in it. And you learn that a certain system really is necessary to make it look like a weaving, a certain horizontal, vertical directions or some very regular diagonals. But if you just scatter them on a piece of paper, they don't look like a weaving.
In another lesson, she widened their view of the origins and purpose of weaving.
I made them imagine that no materials existed and that we were in Peru at the coast, at the desert coast, And there we were in the sand with the sun over us and some wind and the water with marvelous fish quite near. So you put a few vines together, or the skin of the fish you cut into strips probably and try to attach them to each other with knots, and you made some open knots which turned into a net and so on. So we developed from zero, gradually invented forward until we invented the backstrap loom of Peru, and then projected it gradually forward to the high power looms, which are just a further extension of the same principle.
After the Alberses moved to Connecticut in 1950, Anni no longer had formal teaching responsibilities for the first time since the Bauhaus. She did, however, occasionally give private lessons to enthusiastic students. The textile artist Sheila Hicks, then a student at Yale, studied weaving with her. She recently recalled her time with Albers. I remember that she had a small standing floor loom in a room off to the side of the living room where she was weaving. Her work didn't appear to be utilitarian in any way, and it seemed to me she was giving meaning and expression to this soft, pliable material. I don't think I understood her work back then, but now I have a better notion of what she was doing. Her intelligent, technical virtuosity. I believe that in the 6 or 7 brief meetings I had with Anni, she helped me think about structure.
Another weaving student from around that same time, Delores Bittleman, shared that she and Albers would meet nearly every week for a year or so in their living room, sitting in a white room on white furniture near a pair of white automobile seats. We'd talk about the threads and textiles and how they behaved. The important lesson I absorbed was that when you listen quietly, threads would suggest what could be done with them. We ranged the world from there.
Anni Albers is rightly seen as one of the most important textile artists of the last century. Her art, writing, and teaching continue to inspire and influence artists and designers all over the world.
Because the material with which Karis and I are working right now is a video, which in a sense is only sound and light, we talked with 4 contemporary artists who have found ways to incorporate sound and/or light into weaving. We came to know each of them as a resident artist at the Albers Foundation.
San Francisco-based artist and teacher Michelle Yee Martin's recent work both transforms and is transformed by light and structure.
My name is Michelle Yee Martin, and I am a working artist. Currently, my main process is weaving, and my main medium is light. It seems strange to say that since it's not certain what light actually is, but I do understand how it works under certain conditions while being absolutely surprised in uncertain conditions. My first weavings began with the use of my partner's stockpile of light gels he once used for his photography. I was immediately drawn to its sleek, transparent, crisp, and vivid qualities. When woven with more traditional fibers and yarns, the gels created tiny windows of light, which relayed another haptic dimension to weaving. When placed against a light source, there is an immediate warmth. Once I realized that the light source not only could be varied and controlled, I decided to focus entirely on light transmission and reflection. I wanted to address the question, how does a weaving translate into light? I am presently using transparent colored acrylics that are woven into various structures. These weavings are almost like large photonegatives that create projections of the weaving, and even more exciting to me are the reflections from these very same pieces. It is the woven structures that determine the colors and their sculptural compositions. There's so much movement in playing with light, as there is with traditional fibers, and responding to one's capacity for play is really at the heart of my work.
Francesca Capone, who lives in Portland, Oregon, has found a way to literally weave with light.
I'm Francesca Capone, and I'm a visual artist, a writer, and a materials designer. My work is primarily concerned with the creation of materials and a poetic interpretation of their meaning. Repeating patterns exist within the workings of our solar system, just as they do within weaving and in poetry. The weather, as all natural forces, creates complications, unknowns that we all must bend to. My weavings in LED have been an exploration shaping light into tactile forms, attempting to emulate some of the light that I've experienced, and materially combining traditional craft with light-conductive technology. The LEDs are difficult. They can be unpredictable in their functionality, and their manufactured intent is not for weaving, so I bend to the forms that they take to. I began on the floor loom with a 2mm LED cord to create my first sample, Star Matter, mixing light with metallic yarns. Skynet was created off the loom in a Fisher netting pattern, an artistic attempt to capture clear blue sky, which is seldom seen where I live here in the Pacific Northwest. The cord used to gather the LED into the netting pattern glows in the dark, so when the light is off, a constellation appears in the work, a multi-phase experience, and a different perception of the same sky within one piece.
During her residency in 2014, UK-based weaver Ismini Simonidou and her partner Simon Barker made a film that focuses on the rhythmic percussion of the loom. In this clip, Ismini is weaving on one of Anni Albers' Structo Artcraft looms that she and Simon had just restored.
We conclude with one final word from Albers.
In my own work and in the things that I admire, I always find that it has to have some kind of almost drawing power, something that gets you back to look at it again and again, and widens your feeling of being in this world, maybe.